Good afternoon and welcome to the ENS 2024 budget event. We're very pleased that you could join us this afternoon, and we hope that we'll give you of finance made in Parliament this afternoon. My name is Charles de Wet. I'm a tax executive at ENS. My area of expertise is mostly value-added tax, and I try and double in other taxes when people tell me that VAT is just 15% and very straightforward. I'm joined by a panel who represent the various aspects of taxes and an economist as well. So Niraj Abedian joins us. He's the founder and chief executive of Pan-African Investment and Research. He comments a lot on what's happening in the country and the economic consequences of that. So we're very pleased that he could provide economic insight this afternoon as well. Also on the panel is Jenny Klein. Jenny is a principal, very focused on employees tax and individual tax matters. Her most hated word at the moment is two-pot system, and I know that she's going to comment on that during the course of this afternoon's presentation. And then the other member of the panel is Mansour Parker. Mansour is a corporate tax specialist and energy tax specialist. Has significant experience, especially in the carbon tax field as well, and he'll give us a perspective on the sort of international and corporate changes that have been announced as well. As always happens, on the day of the budget, there is a budget review that is published. There's a lot more detail in that, and we will attempt to explain some of that, or at least communicate some of those changes that have been announced or what was included in sort of the not mentioned in the speech, but announced as part and parcel of the documents that were made available. I think, if we just sort of start off with a high level summary, and I want to start with what didn't happen this afternoon. I think that our concern always is that the budget itself is going to be a non-event, and it felt to me like it was being teed up on that basis this whole week. We had very important announcements around the employment rate and the increase in that. The election date was announced yesterday. The latest inflation numbers were announced this morning. And in fact, the taxation laws amendment bill, which approved the two-pot system, was approved in Parliament yesterday, and now goes to the National Council of Provinces. So it was almost like, what could the minister say in the budget this afternoon that could trump any of the announcements that have already been made this week. But I think that the tone that was taken is critical in the circumstances. His credibility as minister, what he portrays in terms of what National Treasury has been doing in the background, that is very important as well. And I think that last year we started seeing a trend of not enough detail and also sort of announcements that didn't make sense in the circumstances and couldn't be backed up. And there's been a little bit of a continuation of their trend in these circumstances. And Niraj will talk to sort of some of the gross aspects, the spending changes, etc., that hasn't really been backed up with any substance whatsoever. And I think that is concerning. We'll get to some of the detailed tax changes, but let me ask the panel sort of for their initial views, what they thought about the budget this afternoon and whether it changes anything. Niraj, if I could maybe start with you. I know you have a very strong view in terms of how important this is for credibility and being trusted by the country, by the capital markets. Was that there this afternoon, or did we again not see a good trend as far as that's concerned?
Thanks very much, Charles, and greetings to all present. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I think from an economist point of view and looking at the role of the Minister of Finance in the context of all the policy announcement that you mentioned and all the related policies, the Minister of Finance is not expected to make policy announcements about other ministries, but it is expected to guide and be very clear with the citizens and with the capital market. And those are the two clients of the Minister of Finance. As to how the finances of the economy is going to be kept, public finances, in order for macroeconomic stability and growth and development take place. And that's really the underpin of growth and stability. So in that context, did the minister fulfill his responsibilities with regard to providing a credible framework for our economy to grow and improve the lot of the citizens? My answer is no. And the minister himself, some of you who may have been on this panel last year or on this meeting last year, I was very skeptical of his projections of economic growth of 1.7. In October, medium-term projections scaled it down to 0.8%, and now he says we'll get 0.6. That's his estimate for last year. And projecting forward, if you are a minister facing with that situation, that for almost 9 years you've had continuous decline in economic growth, and during your own stay, GDP growth does not match up to your own projections. You need to sit back and say, where are things going? How do I turn the situation around? Not to live with it. That is the expectation of the citizens. So I think it was unfortunate for me that the minister observed the declining growth, said what others are about doing about it. For example, he made about logistical improvement, electricity might get a bit less disrupted. But those are not new. Those are not interventions that we didn't know, and those are not interventions that are credible. For 9 years, 10 years, we've been told electricity will be solved, next year will be better than this year, and alas, it has gone the wrong way. For exactly 12 years, we've been told that when NDP was approved, and the minister places emphasis on the cabinet approved this for the rail, the cabinet approved the other. Whenever the cabinet approval comes in, cabinet is very good at policies and approving, but they forget about implementation. They fail spectacularly, not because I accuse them, because President Ramaphosa on record so many times saying we are poor at implementation. Now, if a cabinet that is poor at implementation, the minister assuring us that the cabinet has approved upgrading of the ports or private-public participation is no comfort for investors, no comfort for citizens, no comfort for the exporters. And remember, we are in the middle of a fresh fruit season export. Exporters don't need timeline. They want immediate, urgent intervention, and those are missing in this budget. I would have, for example, in his shoes, I would have said, we put a task team made up of the following industries to take care of the blockages at the port. Not cabinet approved, means nothing. So those are the type of interventions, intentional and targeted policy measures that are absolutely absent here. As a result, we see some really very disturbing type of trends coming. Minister, for example, makes the point that now the debt service exceeds 20% of government expenditure every year. Debt service, not debt. Interest rates are high. Government borrowing is now exceeding 75% of GDP, almost at all-time high. And that combination means that for every cent that the government has, more than 20 cents of it, more than 20% of it has to be put aside, not for running the country or taking care of security, health, education, and so on, but servicing your debt. And what is he going to do about it? He says, well, over the medium term, and that means 5 years, they hope to cut it by 80 billion. And that is a drop in the ocean. That is not going to deal with that trend that takes 1/5 of every rand that government has on debt service. And that is the beginning of, if we don't do something about it, it's the beginning of debt trap. So I'm extremely concerned about the government, the minister not literally raising a red flag and putting everybody, including his colleagues in the cabinet, on notice that things cannot go like this. We need to cut back. We need to cut the fat. We need to become more efficient. And because we have failed to do it, we need a different out-of-the-box solution. So for as an economist, I'm very concerned about it in terms of, and I'll end it here and then we can come back to some of the details. By not doing anything, he's basically telling us that we have no choice but to borrow in order to make up for the shortfall in tax revenue. And that means more and more of South Africa's national savings are going to be borrowed on relative terms by the government for public sector purposes, as opposed to for investment purposes, as opposed to leaving it to the private sector to develop other sectors of the economy, be it industrial, mining, whatever the sectors might be. And we all know that not just in South Africa, but globally, the productivity of investment by the public sector is much lower than the private sector, which means the economy now becomes more and more inefficient, which means our national savings and national pool of investable funds are going to be more used for less productive purposes because government is borrowing it than for the private sector. And the last point at the macro level, to observe that this is the first time that I know of in the history of the country that the national treasury, and this is true under apartheid and post-apartheid, that the national treasury has had to dip into the reserve bank savings or reserves, contingency reserves, or import cover, if you prefer. And that's another concern that sets a really bad dent in the credibility of the national treasury and Minister of Finance. Those are my three broad high-level observations. We can come back to the details as we unpack the situation.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Iraj. Jenny, I mean, normally there are lots of announcements around sort of tax rates this year. I mean, how's the individual been affected? I mean, is it a surprise? How do you think people are going to react to it?
Thanks, Charles. So I think over many years, every year we have come to expect an adjustment in the personal income tax brackets. So sometimes the tax rates are amended themselves, but more often than not, they stay the same, but the tax brackets would be adjusted to give people relief from what is known as fiscal drag. In other words, the effect of inflation on earnings. But for this year, for the first time that I can recall, there is no adjustment to the tax brackets for individual taxpayers. There's also no change to the tax rebates. And also there's going to be no increase in the medical tax credit amounts. So what we're going to see is no adjustment for inflation when it comes to personal income tax. And what that means is essentially that the additional revenue that's required to be raised in terms of this budget is going to be from individual income taxpayers by and large. And I think that's the key message of this afternoon's budget for individuals.
Thanks very much, Jenny. And Mansoor, from a business perspective, from a corporate international tax perspective, any major announcements that sort of things on your shortlist that people need to be aware of?
Thanks, Charles. And while listening to Iraj with the introduction, I thought I'd have a quick look at the tax buoyancy ratio, because that intrigued me. Being a corporate tax lawyer, I'm more focused on the income side of the budget. But I find that ratio to be quite interesting because it's the ratio of tax collections in relation when contrasted with GDP growth. So a tax buoyancy ratio of greater than 1 shows that SARS is collecting more revenue, more tax revenue than the economy is growing. And they publish these numbers for each year as well as give estimates for future years. And what's interesting is the trend in this number. The tax buoyancy ratio, let me pick up the document on my screen. The tax buoyancy ratio, the 2021 year was 4.62. It dropped to 2.03 in 2022, to 1.21 2023, and the revised number for 2024 is 0.54. So we have a declining set of tax collections when contrasted with the GDP growth in the country. So that does raise alarm bells for what it means for tax collections in future. And I think it puts into context some of the proposed corporate tax amendments that will be made. The key one that came out this afternoon is the proposal to introduce the global minimum tax. In the minister's speech, it said that a global minimum tax bill will be published today. And we looked frantically amongst all the bills that's been published along with the budget. We found the appropriation bills, the division of revenue bills, but we couldn't find the global minimum tax bill. So it might just have been a typo and it will be published at a later date. So unfortunately, we don't have the meat that will go onto the skeleton of this global minimum tax. What we do have is the framework that's contained in the budget. At a future date, the bill will be released and it will be accompanied by an explanatory memorandum which will set out what it's meant to achieve. Now, the announcement made today is not a new announcement. We've had announcements made in the 2022 and 2023 budget reviews that this would be coming. Today's announcement is the most significant yet because it says that the bill is coming this year, and what it means. And I'll just be reading a little bit from the announcement because it does get very technical. It says that any multinational with annual revenue exceeding 750 million euros, which when we did a conversion into rand this afternoon would be 15 billion rand, 15 billion rand, will be subject to an effective tax rate of at least 15% regardless of where its profits are located. And what this effectively means is that you have an entity in South Africa with businesses in other jurisdictions, subsidiaries, branches outside of South Africa. The profits of those entities are taxed at a low effective tax rate. These are then combined of the group. SARS then goes to the SA entity and says that your effective rate of tax is less than 15%. Therefore, you, the SA entity, must pay a top-up tax, even though the profits are generated by businesses outside of South Africa. And you can see the goal that this global minimum tax is meant to achieve is meant to be a clear disincentive for companies who, wishing to avoid South Africa's 27% corporate tax, fragment their businesses so that they have pockets of their business operating in jurisdictions outside of South Africa, which attracts lower rates of tax. And this global minimum tax operates on the basis of effective tax rates, not statutory tax rates. So the fact that the statutory tax rate might be 15% is not enough. One needs to look at the effective tax rate of the entities before the decision can be made on whether it achieves that 15% effective tax rate. So unfortunately, we don't have the global minimum tax bill published today, but when it is published, there's bound to be a lot more discussion around what this means for SA corporates. I think that's the most significant change. There are others which I can touch on later.
Thanks, Mansoor. So it seems as if that tax bill has just been published in the last in the last few minutes after it started. But I mean, it is correct that, I mean, you know, this is applicable to outbound companies. So it's South African headquartered companies that have got a global structure that would be impacted by it. It's not in respect of you know, typically people think about, you know, the Googles and Amazons and Apples of the world. I mean, your understanding of it is it's not those companies that are being targeted. It's in fact South African companies that will be most affected by this.
Yeah, that's my understanding. This global minimum tax forms part of the so-called the second pillar. The first pillar of the OECD's inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting deals with the digital economy. and the treatment of tax treatment of multinationals. So there'll be a different set of procedures for those. And the idea under the first pillar is to ensure that your big and very profitable multinationals, the likes of the Amazons, the Apples, which operates globally, that part of their profit will be allocated to countries where they sell their products and provide their services. So that issue of outbound companies doing business in countries outside of their residence country and paying tax in those other countries where they don't have a foothold, because our traditional tax rules are based largely on bricks and mortar structures. Companies that are businesses, there's a shop, there's a store, there's a name, there's a brand. Whereas the way business is done nowadays, I can go onto my phone, I can order software. I don't have to deal with any consultants in South Africa selling me any products. I can buy stuff from all over the world. So the first pillar will be dealing with those digital type businesses. The second pillar deals with the global minimum tax. Today's announcement was concerning the global minimum tax.
Jenny, I mean, there was quite a lot of reference to the two-pot system in both in the speech itself and in fact in the details. Now, I mean, for all intents and purposes, this is a done deal. I mean, it's gone to the Portfolio Committee on Finance. The implementation date has been announced. Why is it still so relevant? And I mean, maybe if you could just comment also on people's readiness to it, and if you look in your crystal ball, what it's going to look like on the 1st of September.
Yeah, Charles, you're right. I mean, there was nothing new announced today in the budget speech with regard to the two-pot retirement system. So as we now know, the effective date of implementation is the 1st of September 2024. It was originally, the National Treasury had asked if it could be postponed to the 1st of March 2025, but that was not accepted by Parliament. So the compromise was reached that the implementation date would be the 1st of September 2024. So I think that does create some implementation issues from a timing perspective, because my understanding from participating in various workshops is that industry requires more time than that. I mean, we've effectively got 6 months to go, but requires more time than that in order to make the necessary changes to their systems, their investments, their communicate to their members, change the rules to provide for all these new tax provisions that are applicable, will become applicable. So I think there's quite a lot of work, from what I understand, that industry needs to do. But now we have a deadline by when that has to be done. And I think the reason for mentioning it today is to highlight to people who have insisted that there is an urgency to this accessibility of a part of their retirement savings. And I think that's been a consistent message, that people are anxious to be able to access a part of their retirement savings. So I think the reason for this being important is that there's a lot of pressure for it to be implemented more quickly than say March next year. So I think the other point that was mentioned in the budget review within this regard was that part of on initial implementation, members of retirement funds will have what's referred to as a seed capital injection into their savings component, which is the accessible part of their retirement savings. And that seed capital will come out of their existing retirement savings as at the 31st of August. And it will be put into their savings component, which will then become accessible from the 1st of September 2024, in theory at any rate. So assuming that the systems are in place to process that, those withdrawals. So what was mentioned in the budget review was that they're anticipating approximately a 5 billion rand additional revenue as a result of members withdrawing from the savings component in the course of the 2024-25 fiscal financial year. So I think the message is that this is happening, and it's happening quite soon. And so those who are awaiting the ability to access those funds, it's to highlight that this is going to be happening in the near future. I think that's the main reason for it being mentioned. And I think, but I mean, importantly, the legislation has to be finalized. I think the Pension Funds Amendment Act is still in the process of being considered by Parliament. So that hasn't been finalized yet. But the Revenue Laws Amendment Bill, as you mentioned, has been passed by Parliament. So that legislation has effectively been finalized. And that will then enable the service providers, the administrators, to make the necessary changes to their systems and their fund rules in order to implement this effectively.
So, I mean, there's still going to be a challenge. There's still going to be a crunch as we head towards the 1st of September in terms of actually getting this properly implemented and being able to deal with all the administration around it. I mean, a 6-month period is very short. I know everybody wanted long. In fact, the industry wanted longer than 12 months, didn't they? So this is going to be a challenge in the next little while.
I think that's right. I mean, I'm not involved in that aspect, but my understanding from the discussions that I've heard is that, you know, industry wanted at least 12 months from the date of promulgation of the final legislation in order to do the necessary steps for implementation. So I do think that it's likely that there will be some considerable pressure on them to get this right. And I think it's fair to say that this is a short deadline, but that is the deadline that we're working towards, that they're working towards now. So I think it's important to bear in mind that this is a complete overhaul of our retirement fund system, in the sense that the legislation is very complex and it requires considerable amendments to the fund rules. And I think that's where, among other things, I mean, among other implementation steps, that's one of the key elements of it. And the financial sector conduct authorities announced that they will be drafting some rules that funds can use to implement these changes. But I think that they need to be specific to the relevant fund. And I mean, some funds have quite complicated rules, and I think that the legislation that we now will see is very complex. And so there's quite a lot of analysis to be done in terms of how the fund rules need to be amended in order to implement all of this. So I think that's where the time pressure is going to become an issue.
The other aspect that was mentioned last year, and we've seen some more developments around this. I mean, was there anything, I mean, around remote working arrangements and the tax consequences of that at all? I mean, we've seen sort of draft legislation published from the, I mean, in relation to visas to try and attract people to do that. But I mean, the tax treatment is still as murky as ever.
Yes, I think that's correct, Charles. So last year in the 2023 budget, it was announced that National Treasury would issue a discussion paper on remote working arrangements and the tax principles related to that. And we haven't seen a discussion paper being issued as yet. So we expect that that's still coming. But I think the second draft immigration regulations do deal with tax aspects, but they don't dovetail with the Income Tax Act as it's currently drafted. So there will need to be consequential amendments to the tax legislation to address the tax implications of this proposed remote working visa. So I think there's still some changes to be expected in that sphere. Yes.
Mansour, as always, I mean, you know, in an XSC, there you know, quite a lot of technical adjustments, you know, again, group reorganizations that have been mentioned. I mean, as Treasury tries to iron out issues or abuses that they perceive in the system. But there's also a mention to sort of a flow-through vehicle that may be, you know, quite a substantial change to the way that we've operated up until now. I mean, what is your sense of that? And have you managed to get any details in terms of how that would operate, and, you know, kind of whether you think it would be an attractive instrument at all?
I thought that is a very interesting announcement. It's a one-liner in the either in the budget speech or in Chapter 4. It says a flow-through tax vehicle for specific infrastructure projects similar to trust and other investment vehicles is being considered. So we had, and this isn't similar to flow through, but we had a 12J vehicle, and the sunset date for 12J has arrived. So 12J allowed investors to get upfront tax deductions when they subscribe for shares in venture capital companies. But Treasury didn't like the idea that the investor gets an upfront deduction, but there could be a delay in the deployment by the venture capital company of the cash which it receives. So that sunset date arrived and it was allowed to expire. Now the announcement is made of a flow-through vehicle. And I've seen something similar in Canada, where you have entities which are companies and the issue was referred to as flow-through shares. So the project company, and in many infrastructure type projects, they incur lots of expenses upfront and the income comes through later. So there's a bit of a lag between the incurral of the expenditure and then the income which flows through, and all that expenses sits in the project company with no tax base against which to set off those expenses. And the idea behind this flow through shares is that those expenses, they flow through the shares up to the investors. Presumably those investors, they do have a tax base and they can then claim those deductions. And I think for Treasury is probably a better model because it's actual expenditure at project company level, which investors would then be able to set off against their income. The announcement today refers to specific infrastructure projects without identifying which ones are being targeted. But we can imagine we're limited to a very well-defined set of industries in South Africa to qualify for this particular dispensation. So I'm quite looking forward to what that would look like. If I were a betting man, I would probably predict it's probably something in the form of a company that issues shares, and those shares allow the project company can probably elect that the expenses can flow through to the investor and be claimed by the investor who holds that shares. Obviously, we're just speculating now on what the shape and the design of it might look like, but I thought that's a very interesting announcement.
From a VAT perspective, there were also a few interesting announcements. I mean, probably the most significant one is around the electronic services provisions. So we introduced, or South Africa introduced, comprehensive electronic services provisions in 2019. But what was different to the South African provisions in comparison to the rest of the world, that we did not draw a distinction between business to business and business to consumer. So this has created a lot of global confusion as far as that's concerned. I mean, a number of entities that specifically, supply services mostly to businesses have simply not thought that it was necessary to register in South Africa. And there is an announcement today that they, sort of to keep in touch with modern developments as far as the electronic services are concerned, they will now be introducing this B2B distinction, which I think is very positive as far as as far as that's concerned, and will sort of reduce the administration for these foreign companies quite substantially. I mean, unfortunately, they haven't dealt with the interim period, from the from 2019 until now. So they probably still have to register and then may have to deregister after that. So I think that was, a significant announcement from that perspective. The other VAT announcements that were made were in around the foreign donor funded projects, which has needed a revamp for a while. So that's been positive. I think there are some changes to the domestic reverse charge provisions, which may be a little bit concerning. It looks like they want to extend that even further. I think that what we have seen in that space is that it hasn't really curbed the abuse in the gold space at all. It's created a lot of work and a lot of admin and a lot of confusion for a number of people in that sector, or that are in that supply chain, but not necessarily solved the abuse or the fraud that existed in the circumstances. Raj, I'd like to come back though to the sort of golden foreign exchange contingency reserve. I mean, there is an announcement that says, the valuation of that amount is about 500 billion, or anticipated to be 500 billion at the at the end of March. And then there seem to be two very significant transfers out of that. The 150 billion rand that will go to settle loans, which I think is a good thing, but is the reason that there could be sort of very limited tax adjustments as far as that's concerned. And then another 100 billion that is transferred to a general currency, a general reserve at the Reserve Bank. Now, that's about 50% of that total reserve. And you made the point about how important it is to support the currency when it's required, and imports and exports, and especially with the issues around Transnet, and the ports, in terms of being actually able to earn foreign exchange. Isn't that number of 50% excessively high and irresponsible in the circumstances? Was it a playoff against sort of messing with the tax system and to take a risk, sort of at the Reserve Bank? And does this also mean that people will now be more concerned about the independence of the Reserve Bank that we seem to go through every few years?
Yeah, I think, Charles, what's fascinating and maybe completely coincidental, but the reality is that 250 million is the same 250 million that the National Treasury capitalized Eskom. And remember, at the time where Eskom was desperate, there was a lot of political play within the ANC, particularly, that the Reserve Bank must come and rescue Eskom. Well, they didn't do it at that time, but now the 250 effectively does the same thing. Is that a wise thing to do on two fronts? I believe not. Legally, there's absolutely nothing wrong. Let's be absolutely clear. Those reserves belong to the balance sheet of the state. But those reserves are there not by accident, because the Reserve Bank acts as the treasury, if you like, of South Africa Inc., which means the cash flow imbalances, if it happens. For example, we have imports that we have to pay weekly, daily for the suppliers wherever they sit in the globe. But we also get exports from our country that brings in foreign exchange. But let's say, for argument's sake, for 3 weeks, our exports are impeded. The ports are not working. The rail is not working. Electricity doesn't come in, etc., etc. So we have to settle our foreign liabilities, but we are not getting foreign exchange earnings. This is the reserve that covers our imports. Our typical stable macroeconomic and growing macroeconomic environment requires anything from 12 to 18 months of import cover, not weeks, months, so that this economy is capable of growing without hesitation, without any risk of default or inability to honor its import liabilities. Now, in South Africa, over the past few years, because of the conditions that we have all seen, dwindling growth, downgraded economy, sovereign risk, etc., etc., our economies hasn't been growing, but our import cover has also been dwindling to weeks, not years, not months. And therefore, in that context, if you take half of it away, what you do, you limit the Reserve Bank's ability to have tools to finance the operations of the South African Inc. That's a very, very negative thing, and I have absolutely no doubt that the rating agencies are going to come on that quite heavily. The second one, of course, is the fact that this is an act of desperation, not inspirational policy making. It's a desperation that I've got no other option. I need 250 billion. The economy is not growing. I cannot tax, borrow I cannot do, because my borrowing levels have already reached in excess of 75%. So I'm heading for debt trap. So I think, and it's a year of elections. So that is not also an option, because we know the consequences of that in terms of popular negative impact that it has on the electorate. So I think it is unfortunate. It's excessive, without a doubt. If it was 10%, 5%, well, it wouldn't, in the general scheme of things, wouldn't matter. But when you have 500 billion and you take half of it away, but also you set a precedence. And that's as important from a credibility point of view. It signals to the capital market that you have a government that, instead of anticipating and taking proactive and strategic interventions ahead of time to prevent crisis, it waits until beyond the crisis, and then it does these desperate things, and which is exactly what it is. So from a signaling point of view, from a credibility point of view, it's not good. From a stability of macroeconomic environment, insofar as the ability or degrees of freedom for the Reserve Bank to manage the macroeconomic volatilities, is also a very, very negative.
Raj, I mean, the fact that there was nothing said about Transnet, I mean, does that signal a change in policy? I mean, we've seen Eskom being rescued a few times, and I think it would be very easy to put a case together that Transnet needs to be rescued as well. I mean, do you think that? I mean, is there policy there, or is it just the fiscal constraints are now at the point where there is literally just nothing that can be done in the circumstances?
Nothing can be done, and I'm quite frankly, I'm not at all worried that they said nothing. I would be more worried if they committed to another 100, which will become another 500 billion. Remember SAA's story. Every time they said 5 billion, it turned out it's like opening the floodgate. 5 years later, we've paid 25 and eventually collapsed. Now, as I understand, and the minister refers to it in his speech, that the cabinet has approved private sector participation. Read into it a framework for concessioning of the rail and port operations to private sector, which is the right move. But the minister obviously is not bold enough. The policy within the cabinet is not clear enough to put a timeline to it. If the minister has said the cabinet has approved, and then we have further taken cognizance of the falling economy and constraints on its growth, and therefore we're going to roll out this thing in the next 3 months, 6 months, that would be the job of the Minister of Finance. But he doesn't. He says, well, the cabinet has approved, what else can I say? Which means he is abdicating that role that the Minister of Finance has in order to make sure that revenues flow in. If revenues want to flow in, the obstacles to growth has to be removed. The flip side of the same coin is it's his constitutional responsibility to avert the ballooning of public debt, which comes at the expense of not just the rich, but very importantly at the expense of the poor, because soon, in fact, already he cannot give any further promise of support on the welfare, as much as we think that is already too high. 25 million people get it every month, but the poor are living on that. And therefore, the minister is, in a way, closing that opportunity from a political economy point of view for the welfare of the society. And therefore, he's allowing this public debt to just be on a free float, and which means it comes at the expense of the poor at the end of the day.
There was also, I mean, an announcement, I mean, on the value-added tax side around the claiming of input tax. And they talk about it being a clarification. And I mean, there's always been this debate in the VAT world as to, you know, when you need to change an amount in a VAT return, do you in fact go back and do that in the original return where the error was made, or is VAT a continuous compliance system and you make the change when you become aware of it, so you never amend any previous returns at all? And I mean, I think that I mean, our view has been that technically it is possible to go back and amend returns, and I mean, the legislation now seems to imply that I'm a little bit concerned about that from an administrative perspective. You know, if every time you need to go and amend something specifically in a return, you know, be it on an input tax that hasn't been claimed or VAT on imported services that hasn't you know, that was declared incorrectly because somebody's now needed to come and register in the circumstances. I mean, it has a significant impact on prescription because that means that every time you amend a return, that, you know, prescription starts running again for a 5-year period. So I mean, we're going to have to see exactly what those detailed changes are in practice. You know, up to now, it's been sort of reasonably difficult to make changes on e-filing, and you make changes in your current VAT return. But there has been a fair amount of debate at SARS in the last little while around this, and it's often around the fact that what auditors try and do is they raise the assessment on the output tax side and generate a significant result, but it actually doesn't really result in any additional funds that flow into SARS because they're inputs that can be set off against that. So it does have an interest impact, and I think that's what the debate's about, and is something that you know, we'll get clarity on once the amendment bill is available. Mansoor, from a corporate tax perspective, I mean, you know, sort of carbon taxes, you know, changes in that space, electric vehicles that we're going to start manufacturing and bring Elon Musk back to South Africa?
There's a very benign statement on carbon tax. The one is the increase in the rate, and those rate increases were legislated last year. So we know what carbon tax will be up until 2030. So the rate increase is not a surprise. But there's a sentence following that a paper will be published on the second phase of the carbon tax, and that paper will be published for public comment later in this year. Now, it's quite easy to overlook the significance of that statement, because in the second phase, there's several things that will happen. Number one, whether Eskom's preferential status under carbon tax will continue. Eskom currently enjoys what's referred to as the electricity price neutrality commitment. So although Eskom is subject to carbon tax, it doesn't actually pay any carbon tax because it gets additional deductions. But if that concession falls away and Eskom starts paying carbon tax, then you're going to find lots of industries that's reliant on Eskom purchased electricity having higher input costs. So you find our mining sector, they are very low emissions. They're not very big carbon taxpayers, but they buy huge amounts of diesel and huge amounts of electricity from Eskom. So if Eskom starts paying carbon tax, I think the first thing that they will do is they'll go to NERSA to ask for the tariff that they charge to be changed. And so that, I think, will be a very critical part of that paper that will be released. What will be the effect on the current electricity price neutrality commitment? The other key part will be the allowances, which currently shield lots of greenhouse gas emissions from carbon tax. So carbon taxpayers, they work out their gross emissions and they deduct 60% and up to 90% of those emissions before working out the net, the taxable emissions, and they pay carbon tax on that net. So the rates have increased, but the net amount of taxable emissions hasn't, because the allowances are still in place. But those allowances will be dealt with in this paper. This paper will address how the allowances will be handled during the second phase. Will they be whittled down? Will they be removed? Will they be changed? Will they be altered? So companies who are currently facing carbon tax, I think in the second phase, it's going to be the settling in period that we've had from 2019 to now is coming to an end, and the rate of increase will be far steeper during the second phase. A third aspect not dealt with in the budget is the climate change bill. Looks like it will be passed into law, I would say, in the first quarter of this year. It's been passed by approved by the National Assembly, been sent to the NCOP for concurrence. Thereafter, the president will sign it. When that is passed into law, a higher punitive rate of carbon tax of 640 Rand will be introduced into the carbon tax bill for emissions which exceed the carbon budgets that's given to companies. The current rate of carbon tax is 190 Rand. The punitive rate for excess emissions will be 640 Rand. So that's quite a steep jump for companies whose emissions exceed their carbon budgets. So I think a tax that was sitting somewhat on the fringe for many industries, it was quite a big issue for chemicals, iron and steel, electricity, but not that much of an issue for many other industries, will now start biting a lot harder during the second phase.
Raj, I mean, the one thing that didn't seem to be there, or maybe the two things that weren't there was, I mean, there was very little detail on the basic income grant. I mean, in the president in SONA said that, you know, the Minister of Finance would announce details. He promised it would increase. But I mean, he ducked the question completely. I don't know if there's any in the expenditure analysis. We see how much we've budgeted for it. But in an election year, you would almost have, you know, would have thought that would have been something that he would have beat the drum on. But that doesn't seem to have happened.
Yeah, I think that's inconsistency. But on the other hand, for the electioneering, is put a 8.4, almost 8.5 billion for national health insurance, phased over a couple of items over the next few years. Interesting to just, if you unpack that 11.6, call it 12 billion of it goes to 2023 wage agreement. So it's a retrospective allocation in the name of national health insurance. Then 27 billion of it goes for infrastructure, which I presume upgrading of hospitals and all that. So I think the disaster relief grant, which people want to turn it into a permanent basic income, nothing. The minister is silent on it, despite the president's promise. But clearly, from what is written in the speech and allocations that are given, national health insurance is now becoming more a sort of thin end of the wedge that will grow over time. And it is something that, interesting enough, in the last year's budget speech, this minister said it's not affordable. So that's a complete U-turn from saying it's not affordable to now allocating resources to it. So I think that there is a lot of politics going on, and unfortunately, if I was going to predict, and maybe you can hold me accountable to it next year, if ANC comes back with majority of about 50, that 350 rand per month will become the basis of a permanent income grant. That's why the minister is now sort of ignored it, because he cannot increase it. There is no space for it. And he cannot pronounce on its affordability, because the president has said it will transmute, it will be revolved into a basic income grant. So there are these are the two important permanent fiscal commitments that can only grow over time. The minute that you introduce a new basic income grant or whatever, you can expect at the very least inflationary adjustments every year, happily ever after, which means in the context of a low tax revenue, high and growing public debt, and those two will become new drivers of public expenditure. In fiscal language, we refer to those as non-discretionary. In other words, no matter which government comes to power, they've got no control over it. It just gets on its automatic trajectory. So those are real short-term decisions that have got medium to long-term consequences for the fiscal management of the country.
The minister used 4,845 words this afternoon. I mean, there was a lot of detail that was missing. I mean, as a matter of interest, the Minister of Finance that always used far more words was Pravin Gordhan. He always used in excess of 9,000 words to deliver his budget speech. Mansoor, any final thoughts? Anything that that was really missing. I'm not going to ask you, Raj, what was missing, because we'll spend another couple of hours talking about it. But from a tax perspective, from a corporate international tax perspective, anything that maybe should have been there?
Yeah, look, I must say, from a personal tax perspective, bracket adjustments were missing. That's something that I would have liked. Quite a bit. A corporate international tax, sorry, and I know I'm shifting a little bit because there were some interesting announcements on the capital flows management exchange controls, and I'd allow you to have a few minutes left. So sorry, I thought I'd just mention these points because there's a different part in the budget that deals with the financial sector update. And a few capital flow management reforms have been proposed. They're under lofty titles such as fostering business growth, promoting investment, and promoting trade. But what we have are increases in the limits of entities. For instance, companies operating in the fields of technology, media, telecoms, exploration, and other R&D will not require Reserve Bank approval for investments to raise foreign loans and capital for the operations up to a limit of about 5 billion. So there's a few aspects out there, and for investments exceeding 5 billion per company, then they do require the Reserve Bank's Financial Surveillance Department approvals. And there's a few other concessions made, such as promoting investment in the regions, SA private equity funds, provided those funds are licensed with the Financial Sector Conduct Authority to invest. They can invest offshore up to a limit of 5 billion without prior approval. Investments exceeding 5 billion per applicant company per calendar year require approval from the FSD. On the corporate national tax side, Annex C has got a host of amendments on corporate reorganization rules, third-party back shares, C2C provisions, which seems to be tweaked from year to year. So I think there's quite a bit for us to deal with in this year's TLAB.
Thanks, Mansfield. Jenny, I mean, you said that, and Mansfield's made the point, no fiscal drag adjustment. I mean, we said at the beginning of the call that that may still come back to bite because people understand nothing, maybe, so the impact on that. And I mean, you made the point around taxpayer. I mean, that, maybe it's the broader population as opposed to the people that are on the tax net. But I mean, anything significant from an individual tax perspective? Any final comments?
So there weren't really any major announcements other than the missing fiscal drag adjustments, which we've spoken about, which affect individuals and employment. There are a couple of interesting proposed amendments in the Annex C where they set out some of the tax amendments that they're looking at for the coming year. And I think one which is quite interesting is to align our transfer pricing rules with the rules the anti-avoidance rules that deal with interest-free and low-interest loans to trusts. So I think that's something that can have an impact. And essentially, because of the way the section's currently drafted, there's potentially a double tax treatment of those types of loans. And I think, so that's a welcome change. I think if we can see an amendment to deal with that, I think fairly probably unintended consequence, that would be a good thing. And the other sort of small point that I noticed was that they're considering allowing the alternative dispute resolution mechanism or process to apply at the objection stage of a tax dispute, which I think is a good idea, as currently it only applies at the appeal stage. I think that's something that would also be welcomed if it was introduced. But again, as I say, no major announcements affecting individuals in particular.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. I mean, and for listening to our comments and our analysis of the budget. I mean, to the panel, thank you very much. I know that to get the documentation at 2 o'clock and to analyze it and to provide an informed view by 5 o'clock is not always very easy to do. But thank you very much for the time and effort that you put into it. And I mean, to everybody that participated and listened to us today and asked some questions along the way. Thank you very much. We appreciate you joining us. I'm sure that there will be lots of budget analysis in the next few days as everybody unpacks the details. And we'll wait for the draft bills to get some of the detail and the real impact of what it is, and not, you know, do our best not to paint too a negative picture as far as that's concerned. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a great evening.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.